honor to welcome Michael Chessum here to this joint meeting of the NDP Socialist Caucus, which Momentum has helped mobilize for as well. As many of you probably know, in 2015, an absolute earth-shattering event happened where the dominant historical party of social democracy in Europe, the granddaddy of them all in a sense, along with the German Social Democrats obviously, was won over by a mass movement from below of ordinary working class people, young people, for socialist change. They've elected somebody, Jeremy Corbyn, who went to jail for not paying his poll tax. Jeremy Corbyn, who sponsored a motion in Parliament to rehabilitate the name of Leon Trotsky. Jeremy Corbyn, when he was elected leader of the opposition, refused to meet with the Queen for 6 weeks almost. And when they did not bow to this person. Probably the first time in history the Queen has ever met a leader of the opposition who has not been more than ready to bow in her presence. He's a Republican. He supported the United Ireland, supports the abolition of the monarchy, renationalization of privatized industries, and transforming the Labour Party as a mass social movement. Michael Chessum was essential in electing Jeremy as the leader of the Labour Party. He was he writes for the New Statesman, The Guardian. He was the leader of the 2012 student strikes, and he's a little bit of a humble guy. He's also a speechwriter for Jeremy as well. So I'd like you all to give like a big, cheery welcome to Michael Chessum. He's really looking forward to having him. We're very lucky to have him here.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me here. I was kind of, when told you have an hour, I was almost daunted, but then I started to write down what I actually wanted to say, and I think I may use almost an hour. So bear with me, but I'll leave as much time as I can for questions, because I think I don't necessarily know what you want to know, and it will be useful. So I look forward to questions at the end. I suppose I'll cover 4 basic areas. I think I'll sort of try to introduce a bit about what Momentum is and what Momentum does in the UK. I'll give a bit of background to Jeremy Corbyn's initial victory. I'll talk a bit about the tactics and the strategy of the campaign that we fought. And then I'll talk a little bit, though probably not as long as I'd like to, about where we are now. So just in terms of Momentum, who we are and what we do, we are, I suppose, a grassroots network of activists in the Labour Party, broadly socialist in orientation. We came out of the leadership campaign in 2015. We ended up running the leadership campaign in 2016 when, of course, Jeremy Corbyn was challenged by right-wing MPs inside his own party. And I suppose our purpose, broadly defined, is two broad purposes, one being in and for the Labour Party, so intervening in and campaigning for the Labour Party, versus a broader social movement function in society. And those two purposes sit together quite well and sort of make up most streams of our work. We have 120 local groups across the country. Those are organised into various regional networks as well, but there are 120 local groups, probably a few more than that, not all of them are yet verified, and the 120 figures are slightly low. We have 20,000 members, dues-paying members, and we initially had 120,000 supporters, though that's now gone up to, I think, somewhere near 180,000. We have a democratic structure, which is, broadly speaking, comes up through the local groups via regional groups to a national committee and then a steering committee, which is what I'm on. So my role is I'm the treasurer of the organisation, which means I have the joy of producing budgets for the organisation, as well as sort of various other things, just running the organisation in general. There are various ways you can talk about the composition of Momentum and who is Momentum and where it comes from. And I think in some ways there's a temptation for me to start by sort of listing the groups and sects that are involved and sort of trying to work out the ecosystem of which socialist group was where in what year and where they did it. But the honest answer is that Momentum really truly comes from an entirely new political phenomenon, which has roots in the traditional labour movement, roots in Trotskyist groups, maybe, and roots in the labour movement, but is not primarily composed of one group or another group. The 2 largest Trotskyist groups in the UK, the Socialist Party and the Socialist Workers' Party, are not in the Labour Party or Momentum. And in general, when you see socialist groups like Trotskyist groups they're sort of brought up as bogeymen, either by the right-wing press or for internal political debates. But it includes a lot of other people like me who come from the social movements of 2010 and thereafter, and I'll go into more detail on them in a minute. And the profile of the membership is, people often talk about the membership being very, very young, and that is true, but it's young and old. So what we have in Momentum is a lot of very young people who are very mobilised and who do a lot of work, but also a lot of people who are returners from the Labour Party, who left when Blair took over the Labour Party in the 1990s, and who have now returned to the Labour Party, sitting alongside a younger grassroots membership, which, like me, comes out of social movements. A lot of people went into the Green Party for a while, and then came back to Labour. And so in the office, as a 27-year-old, I'm kind of a bit of a granddad. In comparison, I'm not joking. I'm well past the average age of people who work in the office on a day-to-day basis. And it is basically the broadest left-wing organisation in British history, other than the Labour Party itself. It includes all kinds of traditions, new and old, all kinds of cultures, organising cultures, democratic systems, expectations, orientations, which come together and meet for the single purpose of transforming the Labour Party and bringing Jeremy Corbyn to power. But with that comes all kinds of frictions, and I'm sure for those of you who follow Momentum, you may have seen some of those frictions come out sort of in recent weeks. But anyway, so to begin properly, I was asked to answer the question, how did Corbyn win? And I thought I would begin this by giving 3 quite facetious and irritating answers, which will serve as the beginning of my answer, which is, firstly, he hasn't yet won. We are not in government, and I think it's important not to overstate the success that we've had. Yes, we have transformed British politics. No, we are not yet a socialist government. In fact, we are some way from being that. A Conservative Party in the UK, which is the most disciplined and cleverest ruling class party anywhere in the world, has quite a strong grip on power. And it may be a while until we get power. The second is that he won by getting more votes than any other candidate in the race, which sounds very simple and annoying, but I think that there's a serious point behind that, which is the left, after decades of irrelevance, found a way to embrace mass politics. We reached out to a broad alliance of people from social movements, from anti-war movements, from all kinds of different places, but also quite consciously to a broad alliance of people a long way to our right, who found themselves fed up with neoliberalism and fed up with Tony Blair's experiment on the Labour Party, and who wanted to reclaim the social democratic tradition by using the left, because we were the people who had the ideas at the time. And because we managed to find a way of not compromising our basic politics, but finding a way to express them which was non-dogmatic and which was comprehensible and accessible to a much broader layer of people. But the third answer, annoying answer, is that I have absolutely no idea why Jeremy Corbyn won, and that's not really true. I'm going to give you an answer for why I think Jeremy Corbyn won, but to an extent what's going on here is there is an earthquake happening under the politics of the whole of the Western world. You look all the way across Europe. I campaign strongly against Brexit, but Brexit is another example of that phenomenon. Hate Trump, but Trump is an example of that phenomenon, and as is Bernie Sanders, that no one quite fully understands. And so I think it would be wrong for me to give you a definitive answer for why Jeremy Corbyn won. And if anybody ever tries to give you a definitive answer for why Jeremy Corbyn won, or why the world is polarising as it is, or what's happening to the nature of the working class, then regard them with suspicion. Because no one really yet properly understands what's happening here. It's certainly not the case that we thought we would win. No one saw this coming at all. There was something called the Left Platform, which I remember very vividly from just after the May 2015 general election, when Labour lost and the Conservative Party got a majority. And we were gathered together in a hall, about 200 people, chaired by John McDonnell, who's now the Shadow Chancellor, the most senior Shadow Minister in charge of the economy, and we were told as the left platform, basically, in a room where the average age must have been 65, there is absolutely no way we can get anyone onto the ballot paper because of the party rules, and even if we did, we couldn't win. And everyone went home feeling extremely depressed. And if you'd taken me from there to being flown over to Toronto to sort of speak as some kind of beacon of hope to the world, or I've spent a fair bit of time in Greece following what's happened there. I was there for the referendum last July, actually, which also happened during the leadership campaign, and I went there again this October, and I interviewed some of my old contacts, and what they were saying is, we the Greek left regard Jeremy Corbyn and the British Labour Party as a beacon of hope. I think, look, you're the Greek left. This is crazy. If you told me that, I would not have believed you. And so, I suppose what I'm trying to say, why I have absolutely no idea, is that none of us saw this coming, and that there are factors at play which very suddenly took us from the depths of despair to transforming the British Labour Party. But anyway, I will attempt some explanations, because it would be mean not to. And I'll start by giving a brief background of what happened to British society and British politics through three broad lenses. The first is the outside. Completely outside the Labour Party is that between 2010 and 2015, I think we saw a period, or 2010, 2012 really, we saw a period of heightened struggle in British society. We saw the coming to power of a Conservative Party-led government. It was a coalition government, the first coalition government in Britain for almost 100 years, in 2010 between the Conservatives and the Liberals. And immediately what you saw there was an attempt to privatise various things and various bits of the economy that had previously not been touched. The first stage of that was what they did to the higher education system and to students, which was the scrapping of support for students from low-income backgrounds, which was called Education Maintenance Allowance. You don't have to remember that, I won't be testing you. And the tripling of university tuition fees from £3,000 to £9,000. And the response to that, and I was one of the organisers of the student movement at the time in the UK, was enormous. So immediately in the November of that year, you suddenly get this huge kick-off. It's the biggest student movement in British history. We have 50,000 people who, on a demonstration called by the National Union of Students, which ends up storming the Tory Conservative Party headquarters, breaking lots of glass. And this sets off a chain reaction of dozens and dozens and dozens of campus occupations all over the country. Walkout days where we had 120,000 people on the streets. All of this called with sort of peer-to-peer, sort of networked groups across the country with no central body of organisation to coordinate them particularly. This wasn't a proper student strike like you would see in Quebec, and that had weaknesses as well. But basically what you saw here was the shattering of the idea that history had ended. Is that what I would say the student movement at that time achieved was a post-history revolt. Here is a generation of people who have never experienced a world in which there is any alternative other than further privatisation, the neoliberalisation of the economy, the financialisation of the economy, etc., who have kicked off in a way that nobody saw coming. And what characterised that whole student protest movement was a kind of an anti-politics. Actually, it wasn't orientated towards changing the political system itself. It kind of almost prefigured Occupy in that way. Everybody kind of called themselves an anarchist because that was what you did at the time. And that was interesting, partly because it didn't attempt to transform the Labour Party. It wasn't orientated towards transforming the government. It was specifically from the outside. And then you've got, what that did was it kick-started a lot of trade unions into action. So by 2011, what you've got is huge trade union demonstrations on an anti-austerity ticket, jobs, homes, growth, were the slogans. Actually very big, respectable demonstrations of about 500,000 people through central London. Could well have been more, you can't really count those numbers. But what characterised this period of protest was big police repression, big violence on the demonstrations, and property damage. You saw the emergence of tactics like Black Bloc. This went alongside, in late 2011, the Occupy protests, which camped outside the London Stock Exchange, and like I'm sure all over the world, these Occupy protests dominated the narrative, and they shifted a lot of the narrative around the banking crisis and the 2008 crash. And this came alongside the radicalisation of trade union leaderships, so that by November 2011 we had the biggest strike action since the general strike of 1926. Millions of workers on strike. And added to that, there was a moment in the summer of 2011 where riots happened all over major urban centres in Britain, especially across England. And these were interesting. They weren't political. They were sparked by, well, they were political, but they weren't politically called. They were sparked by the murder of a man called Mark Duggan, who was murdered actually where I used to live, in Tottenham, by police. There was a vigil outside the police station and a protest. The police attacked it, and this sparked waves and waves of riots that literally burned down some areas across some neighbourhoods in London and Manchester and Birmingham and so on, where there was widespread looting. And so what you have in this period of 2010 to 2011 is serious chaos. You know, there's major social struggle, and it feels like there's something there. And although it was these protests were very, in some ways, anti-political. They were very extra-parliamentary, not geared towards Parliament at all. And they had no political expression. The Labour Party at the time was led by Ed Miliband, an improvement on the Blairites of the past. But basically what you had was a Labour Party that did not want to express these people. People like Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell came to our picket lines, came to our protests, spoke outside police stations when we were arrested. All the rest of it, we never thought they would get anywhere near power. We never thought that would amount to anything, because the Labour Party gave us no political expression whatsoever. And the institutions failed us. The trade unions eventually didn't keep the strikes going long enough. They focused on a narrow strategy of one-day strikes, bringing as many people out as you could for one day, and this would happen again and again and again. And eventually, this proved to be an ineffective tactic, especially when you were trying to negotiate around something like pensions, when what you needed was a sustained dispute that could actually force the government's hand. But what all of these things did, the student movement, the anti-austerity movement, massive strikes, riots, they shifted the public narrative around who was to blame for public sector cuts and the public sector deficit towards the banking system and capitalists. It wasn't an ideologically anti-capitalist movement, but it was anti-capitalist in the sense that it was aimed at the capitalists. It included millions of people in social struggle. It exposed failing institutions like the Labour Party, and almost because it lacked political expression, it meant that eventually there was a movement that was waiting for a home in the world of big politics. The second prism to understand the background to Jeremy Corbyn's rise is the broader Labour movement. That was the radicalisation from below. So grassroots activism sparked by millions of people being involved in these hundreds of thousands of people being very involved in this activity. A spike of high struggle, challenge to the existing leadership of the trade union movement because of that social struggle, and a frustration with the bureaucracy and the building of new militant unionism, especially amongst some precarious workers. But maybe more pertinent in terms of the intricacies of the politics was radicalisation from above. So in November 2010, almost at the beginning of this process, Len McCluskey was elected as the leader, the president, general secretary, big guy, in Unite, which has 1.3 million members and is the biggest trade union in the UK. Now, this was a left-wing turn, but it wasn't necessarily a left-wing turn inside Labour. Len McCluskey he wasn't a Labour loyalist. He talked openly about disaffiliating the union from the party if the party wouldn't represent workers' interests. And he was very, very fervently and openly anti-austerity in a way that the Labour Party wasn't. And it pursued, under him, the union, Unite, pursued a political strategy, campaigning for selections where vacancies came up for members of Parliament. And bizarrely enough, an absolutely critical part of this story centres on a particular selection in the Scottish town of Falkirk, which was a safe Labour seat, and where a Blairite was up against a Unite-backed candidate, a left Unite-backed candidate. And there was a scandal. there was accusations of vote rigging, there was accusations of flooding the party with new members, and the Blairites, on the right wing of the party, tried to use this scandal to do what they always wanted to do, which was to break the link between the trade unions and the party. And so what they tried to do was to introduce a whole new raft of reforms through a review, which was brought together by a man called Collins, so it was called the Collins Review, and Ed Miliband, the then leader, backed this review and gave it his blessing. And what this review came out with in the end, after a lot of negotiation and toing and froing, was that we would have a new system. Instead of the system where to elect the leader is an electoral college where the MPs get 30% of the vote, the members get 30% of the vote, and the trade unions get 40% of the vote, which was our old system, which was rigged against the left because MPs are always on the right of the party. Instead, what we would have is a one member, one vote system, opened out to all members of the party. And because the Blairites were obsessed with creating primaries, a la the Democrat Party, a la Parti Socialiste in France, what we managed to get was registered supporters, where people could pay £3 to sign up and vote in the leadership election. This was viciously opposed by the left. Yeah, we hated it because we regarded it as a means of breaking the link between the party and the unions. And so that's a story that we'll pick up later. And finally, inside the Labour Party itself, it's important to understand that when Corbyn won in 2015, he won amongst everyone. It wasn't just that he won amongst the newly joined members, or the members who joined just to support him, or the £3 supporters, or trade union members. He won all of these sections of the party, and he won a slight minority of actual long-term party members. But there were 4 candidates; they're getting 48%. Is bad. It's basically a majority. So again, what you have to understand is that what happened in Corbyn there. This was a process that happened inside the Labour Party and in the heads of long-standing members of the party who themselves shifted left. It wasn't about people coming in from the outside, although that certainly helped us. And it wasn't just about an anti-establishment radical punch against the right. What this was current Labour Party members wanting to rehabilitate their own social democratic tradition and using the left, because the left had the ideas to do it. And there were a couple of processes that I think helped this. The first was that with mass parties like the Labour Party, people often forget that actually members reflect society because there are so many of them. And what was happening in society? Well, austerity was biting. Housing crisis is off the chain in Britain, especially in London. Education cuts, which I've kind of gone through, privatisation, bits of the NHS, large bits of the NHS, huge job cuts in the public sector, pay freezes in the public sector, a massive clampdown on welfare and benefits to the point where people are driven to suicide, disabled people that have their support scrapped, etc. And a 10.4% drop in median earnings in average pay since 2007. It's like people really feeling it's second only to Greece, that drop in Europe. These things radicalise people, including long-term members of the Labour Party. The second thing is that is the new leadership of Ed Miliband, and I guess maybe this is a lesson that can be drawn on, is that you could almost describe Corbyn as a 2-stage process. It wasn't like we just showed up in 2015 and won. You could argue, and I'm not sure if I agree with this, but really the leftward shift in the Labour Party began in 2010 when Ed Miliband was elected as leader. It was a 2-phase process. Ed Miliband ran against David Miliband, his brother, which it was harsh, beat him very narrowly, and was seen as a break from the Blairite tradition of the past. So much so that Ed Miliband, when he won the Labour leadership in 2010, actually had the backing of Tony Benn, who was the grandfather of the British Labour left. And so what this represented was a shift away from Blairism, but still in support of austerity, still basically saying that they would keep all of the cuts that the Tories were making, and a lack of clarity. So Ed Miliband was radical enough to offend the establishment, he was radical enough to make enemies, he was radical enough to go after the press and Murdoch, especially on things like phone hacking, which was a big scandal at the time, but not left-wing to actually inspire anyone. So, for instance, his policy on tuition fees, we basically had students burning down and, smashing up buildings and running all over the cities and shutting them down. And what does Ed Miliband bring out as a policy to inspire those young people? We will cut your tuition fees from £9,000 to £6,000. And that was it. And that, for me, summed up Ed Miliband. The right direction, a pull away from Blairism, very important pull away from Blairism, and introduced a load of democratic reforms inside the party that we opposed at the time, but turned out quite well for us. But ultimately, not good enough, and exposed the contradictions of moderate social democracy in front of the membership. So, by May 2015, we've got a shift in Labour's centre of gravity, away from Blairism and back a little bit towards the kind of mainstream social democracy that you would expect to exist in a social democratic party, but which has been eroded across the Western world. Trade unions, which are sort of leaning more to the left of where they were. The public actually quite convinced, and the public narrative changed on who is to blame for the financial crisis. The bankers are. That really did change over those 5 years, almost to the point where the Conservative Party, now that it's in power, has to, very performatively say that it will clamp down on the banking sector. And a kind of a layer of mobilised, radicalised people, young, old, middle-aged, whatever, who had been involved in this stuff, in social movements. But that was not at all how it felt. Labour had just lost this 2015 general election, and we were despondent. We'd have been expecting to come to power at the head of a coalition government, and we were not at all positive. So on the eve of the contest, John Landsman, who was an old stalwart of the Labour left, he organised one of the key organisers of the Labour left throughout. He wrote the following on his blog: "There will be no left candidate in either contest, leadership or deputy leadership, and there were no left candidates in a position to win, especially after the party's acceptance of the Collins report, which was the democratic views. Even if they could find 35 nominators in a parliamentary Labour Party which is not significantly to the left of its predecessor, with the deliberate exclusion and marginalisation of the left by Tony Blair has ensured that this will be the case for at least a generation." And within 2 months, he was the director of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership campaign, and sat in the front row when Jeremy Corbyn went up to win the Labour Party leadership. In my regular column for the New Statesman at the time, I wrote something. It was a headline that was given to, which went, "It's time for Labour's left flank to consider walking away." This has come back to haunt me. It's actually one of the most read things I've ever written. And there's a reason why it was so read and so popular, is because there was a genuine mood of despondency on the Labour left and the left in general at the time. We were preparing, some of us, to find pastures new. Clive Lewis, a key Corbyn ally at the time, described it as the charge of the Light Brigade. This was essentially a propaganda candidacy, and that we couldn't get on the ballot. But in any case, we did eventually, and I'll go into that in a minute. But there was another factor going on here, which wasn't just about the process or how strong we felt. It was about a narrative about why Labour lost the general election, because that was the backdrop to the whole thing. And Labour was despondent. All three candidates, Liz Kendall of the Blairites, and Andy Burnham and Yvette Cooper, who were more centrist, but also on the right of the party, all of them had immediately started to effectively say, polling has showed, which it had, that Labour lost because it wasn't trusted on the economy. That was why we lost. And that therefore what we needed to was be harsher on austerity, to shift to the right, etc. And this was a narrative that was already dominating. And I think this goes to the heart of the process that's now underway in the social democratic and liberal left all across the world. In the NDP, in Labour, in the Democrats, that's slightly different in the US. You can look at the German Social Democratic Party, look at the French Socialist Party. The question that we have to answer everywhere is, what is electable? What is electable? And actually that's the argument with which you win the centre ground of your party and bring people with you. Because the orthodoxy says that in order to be electable, you have to triangulate and go towards the centre. And the reality is the exact opposite. As I think what Corbyn is showing, you think Labour are doing badly in the polls in Britain. Look at every social democratic party anywhere in Europe. They're on about half the percentage that we're on, even though we're not yet ahead. As I think the US election somewhat tragically illustrates, centrism is no longer the road to victory that it once was in years past. And if you look at public polling, Jeremy Corbyn's policies on renationalising the railways, that's not just backed by a majority of voters, it's backed by a majority of voters for every single political party, including the Conservative Party, by more than 2/3. On full public ownership of the NHS, backed by the overwhelming majority of voters. Taxing the rich to fund public services, overwhelming majority backs it. The list goes on, energy, all the rest of it. On the issues that matter, we are polling ahead. The problem is about our broader vision and image. So we opened the campaign and we got him onto the ballot paper somehow by basically using, I have to say I wasn't deeply involved at this stage, but we in the broader sense, using a mass bullying campaign, not bullying campaign, that's wrong, but we harangued MPs online. A social media campaign that really sought to say to MPs, we the local members want you to nominate Jeremy Corbyn because we want a debate about the future of our party. We didn't think we could win it. We wanted a debate about the future of our party. And he did get on the ballot eventually. And we put together a package, clear, sharp, left-wing policies that didn't try to triangulate, that spoke to Labour's grassroots, that spoke to our working class base. Mixed with something special which went on, which was Jeremy Corbyn's actual personality. He is the nicest man in politics. I say this as somebody who's met many people in politics. He is the nicest man I have ever met in politics. We mixed it with a modernising edge, a kind of an edgy aesthetic, a modern-looking programme. We talked about a new kind of politics. We didn't talk about going back to the battles that we'd lost against the Blairites. You know, when they removed the commitment to socialism from our manifesto, Clause 4, they called it. They removed that from the Labour Party's core constitution. We didn't try to reinstate Clause 4 in the Labour Party's constitution because that wasn't the battle. The battle was looking to the future, and that's what we did. And we played to a kind of anti-politics that existed, a kind of a hatred of the political class. We talked about a gentler, kinder politics, away from the kind of yaboo nonsense that goes on. The response to this was incredible. 15,800 people over the course of that campaign volunteered to work on the campaign. Between the May election defeat and the opening of the polls, 50,000 people joined the Labour Party. Many more than that joined to vote for Jeremy Corbyn during the contest itself. 100,000 people joined to be £3 supporters. The vast majority of them joined not to vote for the candidates that the right wanted them to vote for with that primary system, but for Jeremy Corbyn. And by July, Jeremy Corbyn was, this ran from June to August and through to the early September. By July, Jeremy Corbyn was ahead on constituencies, so like local chapter party nominations. Unions came on board. Unite, slowly but surely, was persuaded by its membership base and by the activists on its national executive. Slowly, Len McCluskey and the Unite leadership came over, the biggest union. Then Unison, the public sector union that I was a member of for several years, horribly right-wing, leadership definitely not on the same wavelength, but could not resist the swing towards Jeremy Corbyn that was happening at the time. We had teenagers climbing through open windows to try to get into political rallies. Wow. People skipped school to come down to this stuff. In the last 24 hours, 168,000 people applied for a vote. And so there's a number of things that you can learn from that, and I think there's this kind of online versus offline, the way that people talk about the way that election was run. And it's true, we broke out of the old Labour left politics. We left behind a lot of the rhetoric and a lot of our ways of doing things that had characterised the Labour left until that point. And we reached out to a whole new wave of disenfranchised people. That included young people in particular, but it also included working class people who had just been ignored by the Labour Party for decades, effectively, during the process of Blairisation and beyond. Because I mean, one of the big stereotypes about Corbyn is that he appeals to the middle class, and sorry, different terminology maybe. By middle class, I would mean wealthier. So that he appeals to sort of the wealthier metropolitan elites of Islington, where he's from. That's actually not true. The polls that were done during this period is that what Jeremy Corbyn was capturing was working class, was Labour's working class base were voting for Jeremy Corbyn and signing up to vote for him. And social media played an incredibly important role. 15 people were running the social media on the campaign at various points. Not all of them were paid. I think only 2 were. I'm not even sure how many were. I wasn't actually a staff member on the first campaign. I was on the second. Most of them were volunteers. But there were 15 people running social media. And that tells you the volume of stuff that was being produced, the quality of stuff that was being produced, and the level of outreach that I gave to you. But critically, it wasn't social media in a vacuum that just talked about how Twitter changed the world. I think it's a bit like sometimes when people talk about the Arab Spring, they sort of go, why did the Arab Spring happen? They say, Twitter. And then everyone goes, well, that's very clever. And it's not. The world changes when online and offline activism come together and translate into each other. Because as well as having lots of online activity, it's estimated that 50,000 people heard Jeremy Corbyn's voice in a rally during the course of that summer. Just him in person. That's not counting all the other stuff that went on. So now, all of the figures that I just told you got bigger in 2016. So the number of people volunteering to work for the campaign, the number of people voting, all the rest of it, all of that has got bigger and bigger and bigger. When the leadership, when the MPs tried to take Jeremy Corbyn out this summer, we won with an even bigger majority. We won with 61% in the first round, and we really did do very well. The party membership at 600,000 is now the biggest political party in Europe. And that gives you some scale of, not counting Vladimir Putin's party. I've been corrected on this before. So there's a lot of positives to take away from that. There's a lot of challenges for us as well. I started this by talking about the social struggle that produced the people and the ideas that eventually led to Jeremy Corbyn becoming possible. And actually, we don't have much social struggle in Britain anymore. Ironically, what we've got is a left-led Labour Party with a few industrial disputes dotted around, but we haven't got mass protests. The trade unions are behind Jeremy Corbyn, but they're not doing other stuff. They're not creating the backdrop that we had in 2010, that militant backdrop. Momentum has a problem, and the left has a problem with what I would call adapting to civilian life. So we love running leadership campaigns. We're really good at it. But to an extent, Momentum and the grassroots around Jeremy Corbyn has to work out what else we're going to do and exactly what that is. And while young people made up the overwhelming backbone of the leadership campaign, the structures of the campaign, the structures of Momentum, the democratic process are still to an extent dominated by people like me, who are seasoned. I maybe in my 20s, but I'm quite seasoned. I haven't just come to politics for the first time. People like John Landsman, who's been around since the 1980s, and other people who've been around a while and know how to do politics. And I suppose what we've yet to do is to articulate a proper vision for society. What we've got is through running leadership campaigns, basically what running constant leadership campaigns and constantly winning them sounds great, but what it means is that you're focused actually playing to the gallery. You're not focused on building a message to the wider world. And what I mean by that isn't that you need to compromise that message to the outside world, but you need to package it differently, and you need to work out what it is that you're leading with, and what your vision for society is that you want to present to the broader electorate. And actually, it has been paralysing having to take on our own party all the time. That is still the case. The party machinery is run by the right. The senior staff are in general aligned to the right. There are various periods at which the senior staff in the party have called meetings of the national executive, which is on a knife edge. So it's about 50-50 split, with zero notice in order to get Jeremy Corbyn off the ballot paper in his re-election, for instance. They tried that. And there is a real problem with how we do that, because that is paralysing. And there are all kinds of other big issues. I think immigration is the biggest one. I think the process of Brexit has shifted Britain's politics miles to the right, especially on the question of immigration. And what we say about immigration and how we say it is a really complex and difficult issue. But there are massive positives as well, obviously. We have a massive grassroots movement, which is largely untested in terms of being able to go into the next election. We should be able to outnumber the Conservative Party 10-1 on the doorstep, but we don't know what's going to happen. We may be 15 points behind in the polls, but being untested, it is possible that we can still come out and win. And we still, and this is one of the big bonuses of what's happened in Britain as opposed to what's happened in many other European countries, the left has come into possession, not possession, we don't own it, but the left has come into leadership of not a small political party on the fringes with a few seats. We've come into the leadership of a massive social democratic party that's over 100 years old and which should have roots in communities all over the country. And that's really, really powerful. And by sticking it out, we have a chance to actually form a government in a way that we wouldn't even be close to otherwise. So I'll leave it there, and I'll take questions.